call the member for Morani.
I rise in support of the motion calling on Queensland Government to cancel the 2032 Paralympic Games. No significant public polling was ever being done to test Queenslanders' support for these Games, but there can be little doubt that the Games are increasingly viewed as extravagant and wasteful, particularly by those in the regions. The fact is, Mr Speaker, most Queenslanders are simply too worried about the cost of living crisis and emergency, the shocking state of our roads, exploding population levels and the worsening of our housing crisis. In the last week, the IAC President, John Coates, publicly advised the government to scrap its plans for replacing the Gabba with a $2.7 billion Olympic stadium. Coates was quoted in the Courier Mail as saying that the Gabba rebuild risked turning people against the Games altogether, and admitted that the Olympic movement was on the nose in Brisbane. Even Labor must admit that spending $2.7 billion to replace a perfectly good stadium while there are critical shortages in crisis accommodation facilities and affordable housing is pretty hard to justify. An extra 1.2 million people are expected to call Queensland home by 2032, bringing the state's population to 6.5 million. And there are growing fears the state simply won't cope with this population influx and the surge of visitors in the lead up to the Games. Queenslanders are currently facing the worst housing crisis the state has ever seen in generations. The Olympic bill was just going to force housing costs higher, robbing the market of vital materials and labour, and then there's a massive corruption risk posed by the Games as well. In 2021, Labor introduced the Brisbane2032 Arrangements Bill, providing conflict of interest exemptions for elected officials appointed to the Games Organising Committee. And the CCC said, "We have serious concerns with this aspect of the bill as it presents corruption risks, especially as this body is likely to be involved in the management of substantial public funds." This bill also amended the RTI Act, exempting the Organising Committee from the state's right to information laws. In 2022, an exemption was granted to the Brisbane Organising Committee from having to prepare any financial statements for the 2021-22 financial year. And according to the 2022 report by the Auditor-General, the exemption was in response to a request from the then Premier. The committee, he said, should be required to submit financial statements and the annual report for the most recent years of 22-23. To date, and I did read the Audit Office, and they are putting in a report, and there will be a report. There was a report just before the end of last year, and there will be a report in the next couple of months. Whether another exemption was sought and granted, we didn't know at that time. But to top it all off, the then Deputy Premier announced last year that no independent watchdog would be set up to oversee the Games. Multi-billion-dollar infrastructure program had originally been planned, so exempt from conflict of interest rules, exempt from our RTI laws, exempt from submitting financials and exempt from independent oversight. What could possibly go wrong, Mr Speaker? I would just like to acknowledge the amazing job done by the member for South Brisbane, who we're all praying for at the moment, who stood up for her community and called the government out over extreme costs of these Games, the lack of consultation, and for pointing out that the plan to destroy a neighbourhood school and park for a 4-week event was absolutely ludicrous. And I couldn't agree more. Right now, Queensland is experiencing unprecedented levels of financial distress. Last month, QCOS released a report showing that working families in Queensland are spending $200 more than they earn each week just on bare essentials. Petrol, gas, electricity, bread and milk are up 10%. This on top of the record high rents and soaring lending rates. It's beyond foolhardy to be tipping billions of dollars into building these extravagant stadiums and sporting venues. Even Victoria's dreaded Dan Andrews could see that, and Labor should take a page out of their Victorian comrades' book and scrap the entire project. Lock, stock and barrel.